Bleed, Steam, and Steel by Lars Jensen. Chapter 1. Shaking Trombone Stick. This defense battle stance is favored by those who expect to intercept their opponent's attacks. It calls for the quick footwork and for the defender to use his or her entire body to duck, weave around, and even bend into the attacks in order to render them ineffective. The wet rice fields shook as the paladins dueled. The air trembled with the crackling of trombone wood, the thundering of clashing metal, and the cheering of the spectating farmers. No one in the area was going to miss a chance to see Lady Asuka of House Mikoto fight her family-long friend, Lord Heishi of House Abe. Though these duels were common during festival times, they were a real treat during the planting and career season, a chance to forget their work and be entertained. Who in their right minds would pass up the opportunity to witness 6-meter behemoths of the finest steel and stream-hydraulic technology in action? A wild cheer rose to the clouds as Lady Asuka landed a brutal blow on Lord Heishi. He only managed to ward her off as the peasants held up their hands towards their lady, an uncontested point for Asuka. While nothing more than a practice duel, lacking the grandeur and stakes of an official fight, the match brought every worker out to the rice fields, both young and old. The children and teens danced about and followed every move of the giant steam-powered battlesuits. Mothers tried to keep their kids from getting too close to the action, while fathers nodded appreciatively at the fight, commenting on the different styles of combat. They wistfully wished that they were able to participate in the last battles of the westward expansion. Older women in the crowd only half-heartedly complained that work was not getting done, and their graying husbands spoke to one another of the battles that they had seen in their younger days. Back when they would go to the field fresh after a battle and strip the dead of their valuables. A paladin such as these would have made a very, very fine catch, and would have fed their families for months. Another cheer went up into the crowd as their Lady Asuka scored another brilliant hit on her opponent. Asuka's paladin wore a cherry blossom crest of the Mikoto clan, crossed by 2 katana, earning its name of Cherry Blossom Warrior. An impressive helmet with a wasp rested atop the machine. Heishi drove the paladin with the fashionable exhaust pipes sprouting from its shoulders and a tri-horned helmet with a twin-mounted crest, giving it the name Mountain Ward. Had this been an official duel, their paladins would have sported emblems of their history and valor. The warrior class, or firstborn, of Endo was a very proud group, and they loved to show off. As the peasants' fervor and excitement swelled to a climax, Asuka danced her paladin into rough, close combat. The trombone wood swords they wielded were extremely flexible and could withstand the abuse of being in a paladin fight. But hers was showing the strain and cracks of being used too roughly. Asuka drove Heishi back by slapping aside his own wooden blade, grasping his dominant hand in her left and punching his helmet with her own right fist and sword. The Endo design for paladins put the driver in the helmet, exposing them to more damage and backlash. By hitting Heishi there, he stumbled backward, causing his own paladin to fall back. She followed through with a vicious combination of blows to the knees and neck, causing her opponent to collapse to the ground and shattering her mock weapon in turn. She tossed the remains of her sword over the heads of the onlookers and jumped toward the stack of trombone weapons ready to be used. Once her metal fingers closed around the hilt of a sword, she was back at it. Though she had technically won the round already, Asuka and Heishi had agreed that the match would not end until one of them had been knocked to the ground 3 times or was forced to quit. Heishi had just gone down for his second meeting with the wet earth. Asuka's own knees had yet to be muddied. She bellowed her war cry, which echoed loudly from the speakers within her suit as she clashed with a dizzy paladin rising to its feet. Asuka kept up the pressure by bringing her sword down repeatedly like a headsman in an execution frenzy. The crowd screamed, jumping away from the pair as Asuka drove her opponent out of the ring and toward the rice fields. The crowd's daydreams vanished and were replaced with instantaneous worry for their crops. If the paladins fell into the fields, it would cause major damage to the crops and possibly break the fragile irrigation and damming systems in place. Just as it looked as though Heishi would take a dunk in the muddy fields, Asuka spun around him and kicked out one side of his legs. She brought her sword, clenched in both iron fists, right on top of the other paladin's head and drove him into the ground. With that third topping, Heishi was defeated, and Asuka skipped away the clear victor. Her paladin shook the ground and the onlookers as it landed from the skip. Inside her paladin, Asuka was glad for the cloth bindings around her forehead to keep the sweat out of her eyes. It was a very humid day that promised a strong storm later that evening. Also, Heishi had given her a good match, dragging out the duel in the beginning. Now the physical exertion of driving the paladin was getting to her. It had taken him more than 10 minutes to knock him to his knees the first time, and he had almost gotten her twice before that. He was getting better at calling her movements and countering them. She would have to train more on other techniques to keep her edge. The peasants cheered on their lady, happy for her victory and especially grateful for the preservation of their rice crops. She waved to them and gave a deep, formal bow. Through her suit's installed megaphones, she called for the servants to begin carting the wood weapons back to the training tents before calling to her old friend. "Come on, Heishi. You'll want to get started on cleaning up that armor of yours before it begins rusting. I think I really got mud between the joints this time. I'll be done with preparations long before you at this rate." "No need to rub it in," Heishi called back to her grumbly. "And forcing me back the way you did was completely uncalled for and unnecessary." "All tactics are necessary on the battlefield," Asuka recited as the peasants began dispersing. Truth was that she had almost overdone it and had to act fast to not harm her people's livelihoods. The peasants already had hard enough of a life as it was without ruined fields. "And that is why you never fit in at tea and dinner parties," she heard him grumble on his own megaphones. Who else but busybodies would want to go to tea and dinner parties? Asuka wondered. They're no place for us firstborns. "Speaking of dinner parties, you should get yourself cleaned up before your brother has your head for being late," Heishi laughed. Asuka groaned to herself. Why did her brother have to throw a special extravagant dinner for every guest who came by? Heishi was a friend, no less. For a man who worried himself to fitful sleepovers, the family finances, he had a bad tendency to spend money where it wasn't needed, like on fancy dinners. Distracted by her grumbling thoughts, Heishi seized his window of opportunity to depart before Asuka could call for another bout and humiliate him again. A while later, Asuka was out of her paladin and in the warehouse adjacent to the family manor, helping her 8 engineers clean the giant suit of mechanized armor. 8 engineers. It was a complete shame to the family and to her as a paladin driver. These monstrosities of steam and steel needed at least 20 competent workers to make sure that they were properly equipped, cleaned, and functioning for battle. Luckily, that count was necessary only for when the paladin was on the battlefield. In times of peace, it wasn't strictly mandatory, though it was still expected that each noble house with a paladin would keep the requisite minimum 20 engineers as household workers. It was a glaring sign to Asuka of her family's lack of wealth. "All right, everyone," she called her engineers. "I beat Lord Heishi in a pristine sweep today. We have no excuse for not beating his team and getting the Cherry Blossom Warrior ready for dinner." "Yes, my lady," they chimed in unison. "Kabuto, fetch me my gear," Asuka ordered her chief engineer. Her eyes swept the sight of her magnificent weapon. The Cherry Blossom Warrior stood beautiful and tall, despite her family's growing poverty. Thankfully, she had a plan to fix all of it. It was, however, a plan that her brother Makoto was not a great supporter of. It involved her putting the land and wealth that they had on the line for a desperate gamble. To Asuka, skilled in her paladin at a young age, it was a gamble that favored her. "Sorry that I had to humiliate you today, Heishi," she thought wistfully, "but I need your support in every possible form to pull this off." Tying her hair back before tossing on her leathers and goggles, Asuka prepared herself to get elbows deep in grease and steel. She was not going to let her engineers have all the fun. It was also a good way to scrub out her thoughts and frustrations. Soon she was picking splinters and mud out of her paladin's fingers and forearms, her thoughts lingering on her friend. As a fellow firstborn and from a high family, Haishi not only had the training to challenge her, but he also had the equipment to necessitate her use of her mother's paladin. In any case, they always sparred when he came to visit, and it was a good chance for her to further hone her skills with the paladin before setting her plan into motion. Though the first duel would not require the battlesuit as she worked her way up the roster of rivals, she would eventually have to use hers. She would have to put everything in the proverbial pot and fight to win and retain her honor. Asuka scrubbed hard and fast, her blood boiling at the thought of competing in high-stakes matches. It was a desperate state of affairs, but it was to be expected. Asuka's mother had fallen gravely ill a few years back. It was a disease of the muscles and brain, according to the court physicians. Before his own untimely death, Asuka's father had spent an enormous sum of money, even selling highly profitable rice fields to pay the emperor to allow his wife to live within the palace complex. There she had constant attention, as well as a place near the seat of power to keep the family relevant. Mother had taken Asuka's younger sister, Akari, to the court as well, so that she might have greater opportunities, seeing as she was the third-born in the family. Mother was thankfully not entirely senile or hopeless yet, but she was still deteriorating. The emperor continued to ask for more money to have the doctors and servants watch over the failing woman, which was another great worry to the family. They did not have the money to support their mother and the paladin. Shirking their responsibilities in either case would bring grave dishonor upon the Mikoto house. Working on the paladin and training were the things that helped keep these gloomy thoughts at bay in Asuka's mind. Poor Mikoto was not so lucky, however. Thinking of her brother, Asuka pulled out her pocket watch from her work leathers and saw that a few hours had passed since the duel. She would be late to dinner, and she would have to come up with a viable excuse for Haishi. Not even close friends could know their shame. Bleeding steam. Why does the time fly like it does? She wondered. Asuka straightened her back and heard it pop softly. Grease was all over her hands, arms, and gray robes. She had a long leather sleeve on her left arm that had a pressure gauge, small tools fitted into loops and small pockets with nuts, washers, and bolts. She pushed back her goggles, entangling them with the bright red ribbon she used like a headband. Today, her fingers worked quickly to intertwine the same long ribbon with her hair to make a braid. As she straightened up, she stood over 2 meters tall, a height that barely allowed her to fit into the Cherry Blossom Warrior. Despite being 19 years old, her frame was bulky with muscle, and while most were intimidated with her, women grumbled behind her back that she was indeed pretty. It was her kind and fair face that made the difference, though as any challenger in the circle could have sworn to it, that pretty face became a mask of grim determination in a fight. "Kabuto, how are the legs?" "I have finished with the arms. Pressure is good, and everything is well oiled," Asuka informed him. "Everything is well down here, my lady," Kabuto answered respectfully. "Hida is finishing oiling right now, and Janai will have the boiler cleaned out soon. The Cherry Blossom Warrior will stand out when he is needed." Asuka nodded to herself and said, "That is very good. Well done. I'll make sure you are all sent an extra ration of sake tonight for all of your hard work and diligence." The men and women working on the paladin all praised her name and swore that they would drink to her good health that evening. Asuka may not have a full retinue of paladin workers, but she was convinced that she had the very best. These 8 did the work of 20 without complaint, and they had never yet failed. "Now then, Kabuto, if you will excuse me, I must freshen up for tonight's festivities." "I hear the young lord has procured quite the feast in honor of our noble guest," Kabuto said, bowing to her, "and I would hope that along with the sake, we might get some of those delectable leftovers as well." Asuka laughed and promised that she would do for them what she could. As she left the warehouse, she found her ever-faithful servant and self-appointed worrywart, Shu, waiting for her. The young man was a few years older than her and a good 2 hands shorter with a shaven head. He wore his servant's robe as though they were the most precious thing in the world. He immediately fussed over Asuka as she exited the warehouse. "My lady, look at you. You are covered in grime, grease, sweat, dirt. Is that snot?" "There wasn't a towel to blow into," Asuka said with a shrug. "I'll wash it off, don't worry." "But how can I? You're running late for the evening meal. Cleaning you up is going to take at least half an hour, and dressing you will easily take another hour on top of that. They'll be done with dessert by then. Oh, what a shame." Stop your muttering, Asuka ordered, trying to keep a straight face. You know as well as I that washing takes only moments, and I'll dress myself. Heishi is a family friend. He won't care if I don't show up in a festival kimono to dinner. But if we are to present a good image and maintain a healthy relationship that one day may lead to a favorable union, then you must look your best, Shu insisted. Marriage. That was a word that terrified Asuka. Under the current emperor's rule, a marital union would end her time as a warrior. She hadn't even seen real combat yet. She craved it like she did air, though she did not show her desires in the same kind of bloodlust as other young warriors did. But she had been born first, which meant that she was destined to be a soldier. She wanted to fulfill that destiny before settling down. Besides, Heishi had always been her friend. She had never considered marrying him. It would be just too weird. She simply answered with, I think you're getting ahead of yourself, Shu. Shu continued to fret as he led her to the women's quarters where the bath was hot and waiting. Shu must have made sure that the other servants kept it just so for her since hours ago. She quickly disrobed and tore away her sleeves, goggles, and ribbon. True to her word, she bathed quickly and was soon drying off. Shu sent in some young girls to help her get dressed and ready. Though Asuka towered over them, the girls spun her into a cherry red and pink kimono accented with white flowers. She battled them away when they tried to apply too much makeup. Asuka took another long red ribbon and made her customary braid and headband. The serving girls finished strapping a thick leather band with intricate cherry tree designs to her waist. They next fitted long black gloves on her hand and clipped a golden pocket watch in place. One of them clapped, and Shu entered the room like a rushing wind. Oh my, you did finish quickly, as you said, my lady, but you are in no way fully presentable. Girls, I thought I had instructed you to make sure that she was properly dressed for tonight's dinner. Do not lay this on them, Asuka said smoothly, though she was beginning to get frustrated with the shorter man. They know to actually follow their lady's wishes and to not take up too much time, nor dress her in what she is not comfortable wearing. But Master Abe doesn't care a summer's fig if I'm not an image sent down directly from the gods to grace the dinner table, Asuka said hotly. Now lead on. At least you did one thing right and kept the bath hot. If it had been cold, I might have just stayed in there for hours and just soaked. She grinned wickedly at the servant's distressed look at her impropriety. Shu always got flustered when Asuka reminded him in any way of the barbaric lifestyle of soldiers in the field, living without the amenities of manor or courtly life. They wound their way through the halls of the family manor until they made it to one of the central rooms surrounding the small garden in the middle of the complex. This guest dinner room was decorated with beautiful landscapes and scenes from Endo's history across the paper walls. They depicted the Endo peoples rising from the ashes of the world's shattering and building a fruitful nation of culture, beautiful architecture, vast farms, and a proud military, all watched over by the benevolent gods. The room's wooden pillars were carved to resemble proud horses, and silver chandeliers hung from the low ceiling. Makoto waited with a sour expression on his face, seated across from Heishi, who seemed to not have a care in the world. Asuka sat herself at the head of the table. Being the firstborn, it was her right. Makoto, as the secondborn, was head of the household and keeper of the estate, and so he sat at her right. Heishi, as the most honorable guest to the dinner, sat at Asuka's left. However, seeing as there was only 3 of them eating, the protocol wasn't entirely necessary. But Makoto was a stickler for keeping to the rules, and he would have fainted from shock had Asuka suggested otherwise. Most honorable sister, I'm glad that you could finally make it, her brother said stiffly. I have been regaling our most venerable guest with stories our sister and mother have passed to us from the Emperor's throne. I am most pleased you made it here before I ran out of any more to tell. So am I, because Heishi then would have left before we even had dessert. Gossip from the capital can get rather tedious, wouldn't you say? Asuka shot a grin at their old friend. Heishi laughed, and then said diplomatically, There are many who would argue with you that the news that comes from the royal palace is the only news that we need concern ourselves with. It is something that rules even our lives as warriors. Asuka sighed and said flatly, "Don't get me started on that. Glory and eternal life to the Emperor, but he is third-born. He has no idea how to deal with soldiers. His current fetishes are ruining the traditions that have kept our country prosperous and free from invasion. I could counter-argue that his most recent decrees would bring untold wealth and advancement to our nations," Makoto simpered before taking a sip of peach and apple tea. Once he was done, he continued, "But then again, I will never understand how you firstborns think. The warrior ways are truly their own, and play no part in my business." "I rather think they do, most noble brother," Asuka said lightly, "or at least they will." Makoto narrowed his eyes and spat back. "Why don't you then tell the fascinating tale of how you came to be so late to this meal? The fish is getting cold, to say nothing of the rice." "Now please, there is no need for vipers at the table," Heishi said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. "Lady Asuka, the tea your brother has selected is most remarkable and pleasant to the taste. The hint of mint really gives it a memorable flavor." Asuka snatched up a cup of the cooling tea and said, "Oh, not at all. I will favor you both with a tale, and yes, my brother is quite good at simple things in life. His knowledge of teas is nearly as extensive as mine with how to break a human body with just my hands." Makoto choked on his tea as she said that. Heishi did his best to suppress a smirk. "Now then, the reason why I am so late is because the Blossom Warrior requires a woman's touch. Men may be very knowledgeable with how to make things move, but making them move the way that you want them to is an art only women know. And so, to make sure that my paladin will always win, I must make sure that it is up to my standards, even if it takes half the day. At this point, I guess you could say that we are already married." Makoto's eyebrows shot up at the final statement, and even Heishi smiled slightly as he caught the veiled reference. "I am pleased to hear you take such personal interest in your paladin, Lady Asuka," the young lord said. "Not many drivers make the time to be so invested. It has recently begun to show in the warriors of our generation. Peace has already made some of them softer than they should be." Makoto muttered something into his tea, but the other two didn't pay him any mind. "I want to be ready for the day battle comes to me, since I fear that we will never again strike beyond our borders. At least not in my lifetime," Asuka added bitterly. "That may be so, but not entirely true," Heishi answered after taking another sip of tea. "Lady Asuka, please eat. I would hate to have you faint before your honorable brother's desserts is served. Now, where was I? Oh yes, I remember. Have you heard the news of the king's call?" Asuka was helping herself to some wonderfully spiced fish and strips of tender steak to add on top of the rice as she bobbed her head. "I have heard the news. The stump man announces it every day along with the other news that we get from the capital," she answered. Heishi nodded and leaned in. "No one is yet to answer the call. It seems too good to be true, but once someone does, there will be a flood of warriors and craftsmen sailing to the west. It could be a chance for some honor in combat that we have been deprived of in recent years. The king's call, practically a myth among firstborns. It was an ancient practice wrapped in many traditions. Any ruler around the world could write up a summon to all worthy soldiers and adventurers of fortune from all island nations and beg for their help. Anyone who answered the king's call could expect to have a foreign and domestic protection, to enjoy fantastic adventures, and to be paid very well. The last king's call had been proclaimed over 400 years ago and was the stuff of legends. The massive Western Empire, London, had recently proclaimed the first king's call since then. King George IV was offering very generous terms to all who answered his summons. Asuka had first thought that answering the king's call would be the first solution to her family's dilemma. But there was a lot of risk involved, and she wasn't certain that she was ready to leave her home for some place so far away. It would have also heaped even more responsibility onto her younger brother, whom she loved enough to not just do that to him without first exploring other avenues. "It is a very tempting prospect, accepting the call," Asuka said slowly, "but I'll have to wait and see if I answer it. Like you said, there will be a flood once someone does. Once someone accepts it and reports back to the Emperor that the terms are indeed true, that is." "Ah yes, you are very wise, Lady Asuka," Heishi said, nodding slowly. "Indeed, She may not look or act like it sometimes, but my gracious sister is blessed with foresight and wisdom, Makoto said. Sister dear, when you are finished, I will call for the dessert. He indicated a small china bell. Asuka nodded and tried hard not to shovel the food into her mouth. She may have been starving, but they did have a guest, and she did have some decorum after all. Heishi laid a hand near her plate and said softly, By the way, Asuka, I come here not only to visit my 2 old friends and to eat their wonderful food. No, you also came to get your noble butt kicked, Asuka said around her food, nearly choking. Makoto groaned, but Heishi laughed loudly. No, not even that, no matter how much I enjoy it. I came here to invite you both to my upcoming wedding. Asuka's brother coughed a little and then asked, Is it true? I heard a rumor, but I discarded it. I thought you and... Asuka shot Makoto a meaningful and thunderous look, but Heishi held up his hand and explained. I confess, I didn't see it coming either. But during the winter rains, a neighboring noble family, the Uno family, had to stop by the Abe manor when one storm became particularly vicious. They were on their way to a royal palace and had not prepared properly for the weather. Did they now? Makoto said slowly. Asuka could see that he was puzzling something out. Please, continue. Well, they couldn't go anywhere with the bitter cold, and the roads were in no shape for the palanquin and full entourage to traverse. I gave them refuge in my estate until the weather became warmer and less wet. Their eldest daughter, a second-born, Hisaya, and I became close friends. We share many common interests, and we could not stop talking. I asked her for her hand before the winter was up. Heishi was beaming, and Asuka was very happy for him, even if her brother's mood had been soured even more. She was also silently happy that any thoughts of having to marry him were now quelled. She sat there and smiled, nodding her head at the appropriate times as Heishi talked more about his fiancée. During dessert, he was still talking, but Asuka's thoughts wandered to more pressing matters once again. Heishi's engagement was wonderful and everything, but it wouldn't save her family. Only her plan would. In 2 days' time, she was going to return to her childhood dojo, and there she would begin talking down her rivals one by one and claim their lands and riches. Once she was done, she would have the money to keep her paladin and to provide for her mother.